Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and talk about just the reproduction and all the different groups of fungi. And the reason is because many of these fungi used to be named based on their life cycle. And you'll notice that each of their life cycles are pretty specific to each one, only because the names of all the structures are prefixed with the same term that is used for the name of the phylum. So let's go ahead and now fungi can reproduce by producing spores by sexual and asexual life cycles. Now some of them are only asexual, some of them are only sexual, but some of them can produce both in sexual and asexual life cycles. Now, yeasts, they produce mainly by asexual means, and this is really by simple cell division. Remember, they are eukaryotes, and this is very similar to mitosis in our types of cells that you learned in General Biology 1. Often in yeast produce what's called bud cells. The bud cell is ultimately the daughter cell. So it's going to start out a lot smaller, but it'll continue to grow. And then, of course, you can see that the buds here are still attached to the parent cell. Eventually, they will break off and be independent. Now, some of them produce what's called pseudohyphae. So remember, if you looked through the fungus lecture and or read the textbook, you learned that the hyphae are these long branching filaments. Now, yeast can produce what's called pseudohyphae. They're like fake hyphae. They look like hyphae, but it's not like hyphae. Hyphae are typically just basically one cell. Now, some of them do have cross walls. Remember, if you had read about that already, you know that some are cenocytic hyphae and some are septate hyphae. Well, these are pseudohyphae. So they're basically cells that reproduce by budding or just simple mitosis, but they still remain attached. So they create what looks like a filament, but they are individual cells, so they're independent of one another. Looking at a general life cycle in terms of asexual, often what happens during the life cycle is the spores are going to be released, and these spores can also participate in sexual reproduction in those fungi that can reproduce in such a way. Now, asexual reproduction involves basically the release of the spores into the atmosphere. Let's say they land somewhere, and if this place happens to be fruitful in terms of water and energy source and a carbon source, then they'll eventually germinate. And then they're going to develop into mycelium and then produce structures that produce more spores and then continue that cycle over and over again. Now up here we can see that there are haploid stages. There's a new stage called the heterokaryotic stage, often the dikaryotic stage, and also the diploid stage. So you've learned in plants that the haploid stage, or the gametophyte, and the diploid stage, the sporophyte, are the two main stages in which is alternating during the life cycle. Well, now we have a whole nother stage. It's called the heterokaryotic stage. And this is going to be involved with not the asexual reproduction, but the sexual reproduction. So let's look at a general life cycle production. Now, often they're linked, right? So we have these spores that are going to be released by the spore-producing structures. But in sexual reproduction, the spores can fuse or basically develop into hyphae, which will then fuse with a hyphae from another mating type. So they're not genetically the same. When these hyphae fuse, this is called plasmogamy. Okay, so this is where the cytoplasm fuses together, but the nuclei of each of the different mating types still stay separate. This is the heterokaryotic stage. So each of these nuclei are going to be haploid, and they're going to stay haploid for a number of an amount of time, right? So this could be hours, even centuries. So this stage can last a very long time. Now, the process of fusion of the nuclei is called karyogamy. Now, once the nuclei finally fuse, the organism is no longer in the heterokaryotic stage. It now produces what's called a zygote. So now this is the diploid stage. Now, here I mentioned that the two mating types are going to fuse together. They're basically going to release pheromones or chemical signals which attract one another by sexual means. Continuing through this, meiosis is going to be the process in which creates the spores, which are going to be haploid. So during sexual reproduction, the spores are going to be generated by meiosis. And then, of course, they're going to be released and they can germinate. Now, they can undergo asexual reproduction where they would germinate and produce a haploid spore-producing structure and continue that cycle, or they can basically reproduce again sexually by combining with a hyphae from another mating type and continue sexual reproduction. Let's look at the individual groups. So if you had already read the chapter or reviewed the slides previously, we know that there are several major phyla of fungi. So we have the chytrids or the Chytridiomycota. We have the Zygomycetes or Zygomycota. We have the Glomeromycetes or the Glomeromycota, the Ascomycetes or the Ascomycota, and the Basidiomycetes or Basidiomycota. And then there's the lichens. So we're going to talk about reproduction in each one of these. So let's start with the chytrids or the Chytridiomycota. Mycota has a life cycle that is isomorphic. What that means, if you remember from an earlier chapter, that the structures during the entire life cycle appear similar. So there's no significant difference in the morphology of the structures during this process. Now, what happens, it will alternate between the haploid and diploid stage. What's key to this is that there are swimming sperm. So what this means is that they pretty much live in water, right? So they live in or close to water. The sperm or the spores, they're not really sperm, they're spores, which have flagella. Okay, and again, when spores or sperm need flagella, then they need water so that they can swim and find the gametophyte. Now here we can see the sporophyte is going to produce sporangia that are going to release the asexual sporangium, which again has flagella, so it requires water. And if it's going to undergo the sexual process, basically this swimming spore / sperm is going to go locate a female gametangium and then combine with the female gametangium. We have male and female, and then fusion, which will generate the sporophyte. What's key to remember here is that the spores have flagella. They can undergo asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction, and the spores are called zoospores. Now let's move on to the next major phyla. The next major phyla of fungi are the Zygomycota. Mycetes. Zygomycota can reproduce sexually and asexually. The sexual spores have a different name than the asexual spores. The asexual spores are just in general called sporangia. The sexual spores are going to develop once the hyphae combine. They're going to develop eventually into a mature, what's called zygosporangium. You're going to notice that a lot of the sexual stages or the structures that are that occur along a long time during the sexual stages of many of. If we look at the generalized life cycle, at least the sexual life cycle of the Zygomycota, of course, we're going to start similar as to before. We start out with spores. And these are going to be haploid spores, which are eventually going to germinate. So when they land into the ground, they're going to germinate. So these we can assume belong to two different fungi. Okay, so genetically different because you can see that they have different colored nuclei. The hyphae are going to develop, and then since these are different mating types, they're genetically different, they're going to kind of attract each other. So they're going to come together and uh, eventually fuse. You can see there are multiple, it hasn't fused yet, but you can see there are multiple nuclei there. And because zygomycota have hyphae that are cenocytic, meaning they do not have the cross walls, that there's going to be multiple nuclei that are going to eventually join once the hyphae fuse together. Now, once the hyphae fuse, that means plasmogamy has occurred. And you can see there are multiple still haploid nuclei within this cellular structure right here. This would be called the heterokaryotic stage. During the time that the zygomycota are in the heterokaryotic stage, eventually this is going to mature. It's going to mature into what's called the zygosporangium, and this is specific to zygomycota. Zygosporangium still exists in the heterokaryotic condition, but during which time what soon happens is karyogamy. So karyogamy is when the nuclei fuse. So these are haploid nuclei. They're going to fuse together just similar to what happens with the egg and sperm. They're going to fuse and create diploid nuclei. So you can see the diploid nuclei are now a different color. And we have the zygospore, which is going to be released eventually from the hyphae right here. The zygospore is then going to undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores, which are genetically different from the two original spores that eventually developed into this zygosporangium once plasmogamy occurred. So then this zygosporangium is going to develop these zygospores, which could undergo asexual reproduction, where the spores are just going to be released and then germinate and create more zygospores, or not zygospores, more sporangium, and then continue that life cycle asexually. But these spores could also land somewhere, develop into hyphae, and then continue the sexual life cycle as I just described. So an example of zygosporangium would be the rhizopus. This is the black or the dark, I guess what you would consider as mold. It's a fungus that typically grows on bread. Ascomycota is next. Mycota are quite diverse in their size, shapes, and colors. Ascomycota range from single-cellular yeast to multicellular sac fungi as shown here. Now let's move into mycota. During the life cycle, or at least the sexual stage of the life cycle, Ascomycota undergo several stages and they're named accordingly. So during the sexual life cycle of Ascomycota, ascocarps are going to develop asci, which are sac-like structures, which are going to contain what's called ascospores. So you can see right here, this would represent an ascocarp. And here we see algae cells. Really, this is an Ascomycota, which is involved in a relationship with algae. And I'm going to talk about that relationships later. But here we can see this is a close-up view of what would be an ascocarp. And again, like I said, the ascocarp is the larger structure. You cannot see the entire thing here, but you can see the individual sac-like structures called asci. A single one would be ascus, and inside the asci or ascus, during the sexual stage, this is going to start out very similar to the zygomycota, which we just talked about. The spores are going to land somewhere and develop into hyphae. Now, here the spores are called conidia, and we're going to talk about that when we get to the asexual life cycle of the Ascomycota. But what's going to happen is different mating types, of course, the hyphae are going to eventually fuse together. And in this case, instead of a heterokaryotic stage, a dikaryotic stage will occur because Ascomycota have septate hyphae, which means that only two haploid nuclei will end up in one section of the hyphae once it fuses. Once it fuses, this means that plasmogamy has occurred. And you can see here we have entire structures which each contain only two haploid nuclei which have not yet fused. Again, this is the dikaryotic stage. This can last for a little bit of time, and then over time, eventually those two haploid nuclei will fuse, and once they fuse, we could say that karyogamy has occurred, and now there's diploid nuclei in what will eventually develop into the asci. Now, looking a little bit further, once these diploid nuclei form, they're eventually going to undergo meiosis, and meiosis is going to generate four haploid spores, which are going to be contained in these sac-like structures called asci. These are eventually going to multiply, and then the asci are going to get larger, and the asci are contained in larger structures called ascocarps. You can see right here, and here you can see spores are being released, which can continue the sexual life cycle. Ascomycota also undergo reproduction, and like I said before, we have what's called the conidia, which are going to be the spores, and they're going to participate mainly in the asexual reproduction. Only the hyphae, once they're developed from the conidia, will occur with the sexual stages of the life cycle. Now, here we can see we have an entire conidiophore, which is the entire structure, which is going to create, ultimately at the tips of this structure, are going to create the conidia, which are haploid spores. These are going to participate in sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction simply involves these spores being dispersed. They're eventually going to land somewhere and germinate and develop into hyphae. These hyphae start to form the conidiophores themselves. They're not going to, during asexual reproduction, they're not going to fuse with another different mating type, creating that dikaryotic stage. Here, they're just going to create these conidiophores, and the different types of fungi might have different shapes of conidiophores, but here we can see the individual conidia being developed at the very tips. Eventually those will be released so that they can disperse and then germinate and continue the asexual reproduction or participate in sexual reproduction. So you can see how they're linked together as I described. Now this is the Ascomycota. Now we're going to move on group of fungi, which is called the Basidiomycota. Basidiomycota are named based on their structures. They're commonly called club fungi because they create this club-like structure during its sexual life cycle. These are some examples. Again, just like the Ascomycota, the Basidiomycota do range significantly in terms of size and color and shape. However, they are all only multicellular. Now, just like the Ascomycota, the Basidiomycota have several structures during their sexual life cycle. These structures include the basidiocarps, the basidium, and the basidiospores. The basidiocarp is the entire structure. This is the fruiting body. You would know it as the mushroom, but the technical term for it is the basidiocarp. The basidiocarp has gills just under the cap of it. Okay, the gills are going to contain the basidia, or basidium singular, with the basidiospores attached. This shows a basidium right here, and the basidiospores at the very tops of the basidium. Now let's look at the life cycle. Basidiomycota only participate in sexual reproduction. There is no asexual reproduction occurring here. Now, very similar to the Zygomycota and the Ascomycota, the hyphae are eventually going to, or the spores are eventually going to germinate to develop into hyphae of two different mating types, and the hyphae are eventually going to fuse during the process of plasmogamy. Now, because Basidiomycota hyphae have the septa, they have the cross walls, they have septate hyphae. This is going to result in only two haploid nuclei in each section of the hyphae, which is called the dikaryotic stage. The dikaryotic stage for the basidiomycota can last a very, very long time. It could last from hours to days to centuries. Now, if we look further into the life cycle, during the dikaryotic stage of the life cycle, the fruiting bodies are going to form. These are the reproductive fruiting bodies. Remember, I said the gills, if we look at the close-up of the gills, okay, and then we look even closer of the gills, this you can see the two haploid nuclei in each of the basidia. Okay, so this is the dikaryotic stage. Eventually, like I said, this could happen centuries later. Eventually, um, these haploid nuclei are going to fuse during the process of karyogamy, and then they're going to form, this is going to form diploid nuclei. These diploid nuclei will eventually undergo meiosis to produce 4 haploid spores. Now, these are haploid nuclei at this point, at this stage right here. But if we look at the basidium right here, eventually the basidium, this is that club-shaped structure, is going to develop the basidiospores at the very tips of it. And there's generally only 4 basidiospores per basidium. And these basidiospores will be released, and this allows for dispersal. Eventually, hopefully, they land somewhere, which provides a good food source and some water, and then they can germinate and continue the sexual life cycle for Basidiomycota. Now, Basidiomycota are quite, all species can do this, but some species can produce what's called fairy rings. Fairy rings are just a ring of the fruiting bodies. Now, this actually started where we had the spore landing in the center of this entire circle. So the center would be the oldest portion of the fairy ring. Eventually, the spore would germinate, and then hyphae would develop, and the hyphae are going to radiate out from the center, where they're going to start to mature. Once it undergoes that dikaryotic stage, the fruiting bodies will form, and you can see that ring of fruiting bodies around all of the mycelium, which is not visible. Remember, that's underground. Okay, so that concludes mycota. Now we're going to move into what's called lichens. Lichens really aren't an individual fungus on their own. It's actually a relationship between 2 or more organisms. Within a lichen will always be at least a fungus and something, some photosynthetic microorganism. Now, the photosynthetic microorganism is could be an algae, or it could be a cyanobacterium, or it could be both. The algae are going to contribute carbon compounds to the fungus, and the cyanobacteria will contribute carbon compounds and organic nitrogen. The fungus generally provides a home for the other organisms, so it's a mutualistic relationship, also more generally called a symbiotic relationship. Now, for lichen, the fungus is almost more often than not a fungus that belongs to the Ascomycota phyla. Now, there are 3 major forms described in your textbook of lichen, and I'm talking about the macroscopic. Now, we've got the fruticose form, which looks more like a shrub. There are some examples here. The foliose form, which looks more like leaves. Again, they do have many bright colors, quite diverse in their structure. There's the crustose form, which looks like crusting on rocks and other solid surfaces. Overall, lichen reproduce sexually and asexually, mainly sexually due to the fact that the fungus can reproduce sexually. But remember, the lichen is not really just a fungus on its own. It's actually a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and something photosynthetic. Now, the lichen overall can reproduce asexually by fragmentation. So basically what happens is fragments of the hyphae, which are going to be wrapped around the algae or the cyanobacterium will just kind of break off and then disperse, and then, of course, develop into more of the lichen elsewhere. All right, so that kind of we basically talked about the life cycles of the Chytridiomycota, the Zygomycota, the Ascomycota, the Basidiomycota, and what happens with the lichens. We did not talk about Glomeromycota because Glomeromycota are often Basidiomycota. It just involves the hyphae of the Basidiomycota and a relationship with plants and at the roots of the plants. So if you go back and read the textbook about that, there really isn't anything about the actual life cycle of Glomeromycota, but you should know the two types of Glomeromycota. So I would go back and review that. All right, we're done with life cycles. Thank you for listening. Bye.